Okay, this is Burlington, and here we are in the Channel 17 Center for Media and Democracy here in Burlington, Vermont, with our ongoing series, Nuclear Free Future. I'm your host, Margaret Harrington, and viewers, let's welcome by Skype Kevin Camps of Beyond Nuclear, the nuclear waste watchdog. And Kevin, thank you very much for returning to our program. You're always so welcome here.
Thank you for having me, Margaret.
Yeah, and Kevin, the title we've chosen is Obama in Hiroshima. And this is our president went to Hiroshima only last week. It's only been a week since he was there. And I'd like to start off with your giving us your thoughts on that, on his visit. Just
go ahead.
No, just your thoughts on his visit.
Well, it's certainly a very significant historical moment. I mean, there had been visits before by, I hadn't known this, but Richard Nixon went to Hiroshima in 1964, 4 years before he became president. And Jimmy Carter went to Hiroshima about 4 years after he left the White House, but never before as serving US president. There'd been other high-level officials, of course, John Kerry, just a few weeks earlier, as Secretary of State. And before that, Nancy Pelosi as House Majority Leader, or Speaker of the House, actually. And so this is the culmination of, an important historic need for the United States to look back at Hiroshima and reflect upon what happened there. But at the same time, it's loaded with ironies. So for one thing, as Joe Cirincione, president of the Plowshares Fund, pointed out very eloquently, how ironic is it that the nuclear football traveled to Hiroshima, because the President of the United States does not go anywhere without it's called the President's Emergency Satchel. And these are the codes that would authorize the launch of something like 1,000 nuclear warheads. And so those went to Hiroshima. Another irony of the visit is that the Obama administration has signed off on a 30-year program to so-called modernize the US nuclear weapons arsenal at a cost of $1 trillion with a T, $1 trillion. And so here we are, nearly a half century after the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by the United States. And the US obligation under the NPT is to abolish nuclear weapons in good faith and with all deliberate speed. And far from that, we are planning to have them around for a very long time to come.
How are we, the American people, supposed to deal with this schizophrenia of action? I mean, you call it irony, but they're saying one thing and doing another, right?
And, I should hasten to add that there are many millions of Americans who are, very sorry for what happened at Hiroshima. And that was one thing the Obama administration made very clear from the moment they announced the visit, is there would be no apology. So, there have been some great examinations of the decision to use the atomic bomb. In fact, that's the very title of a book by Gar Alperovitz, who had a White House position during the Clinton years. He's an economist at the University of Maryland. And that book, which is like 800 pages long, published in 1995 for the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombings, was incredible to me. I hadn't known that history before. And it's very well documented that Japan was on the brink of absolute defeat. Some of the military leadership of the United States at the time, like General Eisenhower and Admiral Leahy, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were opposed. They were opposed to the atomic bombings. They believed very firmly that Japan was on the brink of defeat, and that, in fact, the atomic bombings, in the words of the war secretary at the time, Stimson, put the United States on the level of Adolf Hitler in terms of the committing of atrocities. And even Curtis LeMay was opposed. He was the firebomber of Japan, firebombed Tokyo, killed more people with firebombs than were killed by the atomic bombs, actually. He was opposed to the atomic bombings at the time, but I guess he got over it and then wanted to turn the Soviet Union into a smoldering wreckage before they did that to us, I guess was his philosophy. And his line was, if we had lost World War II, himself and the others would have been, strung up from the nearest tree as war criminals. So there's a lot of Americans who have very deep bad feelings about what happened with the atomic bombings. And we've, lived to inherit that legacy. We're far from out of the woods on nuclear weapons yet. There are still thousands of weapons on hair trigger alert between the United States and Russia, just for starters. And many organizations like the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, they circulated a petition before Obama's visit calling for something meaningful to come out of the visit, not just a symbolic moment, as significant as it is, but calling for Obama to announce further cuts to the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal, or at least the relaxation of this hair trigger alert, which, whether it's by accident, unintentionally, or intentionally, nuclear war in the world will devastate this planet. Physicians for Social Responsibility put out a study. It was focused on the India-Pakistan danger. And what they found was the exchange of just 100 atomic weapons between those two countries of a Nagasaki size, which is very small by today's standards, would plunge the planet into a global winter because of all the smoke from the cities on fire. And up to 2 billion people would starve because of the crop failures from this sudden global climate crisis, not global warming, but global freezing. So we are not out of the woods yet on nuclear weapons. And, Obama may have largely missed the opportunity at Hiroshima, actually.
And Kevin, in that so-called nuclear football, that the satchel that he is always carried near him, what is in that? What is actually in that?
To the best of my understanding, it contains the launch codes that would allow the president to order the launch of 1,000 nuclear weapons from the U.S. arsenal. And there's various delivery vehicles. There's missiles in the missile silos on land, on the Great Plains, for example. There's missiles on board submarines. Those cannot be recalled, of course, once launched. President Reagan didn't seem to understand that. He seemed to think that missiles could be recalled. They can't. They are going to detonate over their targets once launched. There's also bombers, which technically could be recalled up to a certain point, I suppose, unless something goes wrong. And those are the codes that are in that satchel.
And we are, the United States is the only country that has ever dropped a nuclear bomb.
Right. The United States is the only country to ever use nuclear weapons in warfare at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But of course, every nuclear weapons power has tested nuclear weapons. So those have included atmospheric tests that spewed their deadly poisons onto the winds and onto the rains. And there have been literally thousands of full-scale nuclear weapons blasts in human history in the last 50 plus years.
And Kevin, in the history that you've read, what about the decision to drop the bomb on the civilians, on the women and children and those living in their own homes in Hiroshima?
Well, it's pretty well established, not just in Al Purovitz's book, but other books, that the Japanese, another book that comes to mind is Paul Hamm, an Australian writer who wrote a book entitled Hiroshima, Nagasaki. So it's pretty well established. His book was fascinating because it really shed light on the Japanese War Council, the War Cabinet, the emperor and his military leadership, but also his civilian leadership. And the Japanese were much more worried about the Soviet army invading Japan than they were about even the US atomic bombs. And yes, 2 cities being destroyed instantly by atomic bombs in the space of 3 days was, pretty awe and shocking, to borrow a phrase from Rumsfeld. But the Japanese leadership was much more worried about a Soviet army that would never leave, they felt. And so they realized in the end that they would be much better placed to surrender to the Allies, to the Americans, who would eventually leave their country and did, than this fast approaching Soviet army that was racing across Asia to try to gobble up as much territory as possible before the war ended.
Is there any evidence of a moral responsibility that President Truman felt about dropping the bomb on children and people who were not military?
Well, Howard Zinn has asked those questions. What links are we willing to go to win a war? And are we willing to kill, at Hiroshima, 140,000 largely civilians in the process? And, another scholar who needs to be mentioned is Arjun Makhijani, who, to the best of my knowledge, was the first to document that the United States largely viewed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Trinity, New Mexico before that as tests. They had spent billions of dollars of 1940s money on the Manhattan Project. And the question that occurs to me is, what else could have been done with those billions of dollars to end the war sooner? Because those were billions of dollars that did not go into building ships or tanks or other war efforts. It went into 2 bombs, essentially, that granted destroyed 2 Japanese cities. But, there has to be the question asked, did the bomb project prolong the war instead of shorten it? So the moral aspects, Truman's grandson is speaking out, traveling the world and speaking out about his moral misgivings about the atomic bombings. So yes, there are huge moral questions that still need to be addressed.
Yes, I heard an interview with Truman's grandson, who was also something connected to the New York Times. Isn't that so?
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I just know his name and his message.
Yeah, but I can't understand how he said that he only became aware of the bombs through a picture book of his child. And that would be in the 1960s or something like that. So it's so strange to me. Or 70s.
Speaking of taboos, apparently there are taboos in the Truman family, but talk about the taboo of radioactivity. President Obama did not mention radioactivity once in his speech at Hiroshima, incredibly enough. An aspect of the bomb that is unprecedented compared to other explosives. It's much larger in size, off the charts larger. But another aspect is the radioactivity and the damage that it does to human bodies in the form of cancer causation over a latency period that can extend not only years, but decades. But in addition to that, there's the genetic damage. And so the survivors of Hiroshima, not just the individuals who survived the bombing, but their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and future generations to come, will live with a lingering fear that their own life may end earlier than it would have due to cancer from the bomb, but perhaps even worse, that their future generations will be cursed with disease and death at an early age from the genetic damage caused by the bomb. And that went unaddressed, incredibly enough, by President Obama.
As you say, it seems that it is a taboo subject.
Yeah, and another one that you mentioned as we prepared for this interview was that, of course, Fukushima was not mentioned at all. And there's real tie-ins between the military atom and the so-called peaceful atom. One aspect of that history that's so fascinating is that the first large-scale hydrogen bomb tested, so-called, by the United States in the Marshall Islands on March 1st, 1954, codenamed Castle Bravo, was 3 times larger than the nuclear weaponeers thought it would be. It turned out to be 15 megatons instead of 5. And that was 1,000 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb. And it led to massive fallout across the Pacific, including the Marshall Islands themselves, which was devastating to the Marshall Islanders to this day because of the radioactivity that Obama didn't want to talk about. And also it blanketed a Japanese fishing fleet with radioactivity. And some of the sailors on a ship called the Lucky Dragon eventually succumbed to their radiation exposure, one just a few months later, others longer than that. But the radioactive seafood, the tuna that was on board that boat, was sold across Japan, and it led to massive protests in Japan. This is 1954. Japan is still under US Army occupation. It's only 9 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was a petition circulated by housewives in Tokyo that garnered millions of signatures, 1 million signatures from Hiroshima alone. And the Japanese government at the time and the US government of military occupation and back in Washington were afraid that Japan was going to go communist, that the Soviet Union and or China would take advantage of these protests against this hydrogen bombing and take control of the country. And so what the US did was they deployed the Central Intelligence Agency, which was ordered to sell nuclear power, sell atoms for peace to the Japanese people. And they hired a CIA agent, a Japanese man named Shoriki, who owned the biggest TV station in the country, the biggest newspaper in the country. And he, with a gusto, sold nuclear power to the Japanese people. He was a founder of the Liberal Democratic Party, which has ruled Japan for 99% of the time since 1954. They're ruling as we speak. Prime Minister Abe, who stood there with President Obama in Hiroshima. And one of the planks, one of the founding planks of the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan is pro-nuclear power. And it just so happens that the CIA was involved in that. So, you know, that kind of history led directly to Fukushima because for decades the Japanese people were lied to, that nuclear power was inherently, absolutely safe. Nothing could possibly go wrong. And on March 11th, 2011, something did go wrong. And now they have an ongoing nuclear catastrophe at Fukushima.
And Kevin, along with that, the ongoing disaster is the denial of the radioactivity from the meltdown, the triple meltdown. Could you speak to that? It's an ongoing denial of that. And the Japanese people, the mothers and children, are faced with this, and no one is helping them.
It goes right back to Hiroshima. And, you know, a lot of this, even nuclear power history, can be traced back to Hiroshima. And the Pentagon at the time, Leslie Groves, who was in charge of building the Pentagon and in charge of the Manhattan Project, had strict censorship laws in place at Hiroshima. No talking about the radioactivity, no talking about the health impacts of the radioactivity. Even reports that were written by foreign reporters were intercepted and not allowed to get out. And it went so far as the New York Times reporter, who had full access to the Manhattan Project, happened to also work for the Manhattan Project. He was a propagandist for the Pentagon. He wrote some of the press releases that were used by the Pentagon to announce the atomic bomb. Lawrence was his name. And his censorship, his denial, his downplaying to the point of denying completely radiation health impacts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! Has called for the revocation of the Pulitzer Prize that he was awarded in 1945 for his reporting on the Manhattan Project.
So this is an ongoing story, the denial and the two-faced presentation of both nuclear power and the nuclear weapons. So, Kevin, let's talk about the parking lot dumps that you brought up in our conversation prior to this program. The United States Department of Energy and the Senate are seeking parking lot dumps for high-level radioactive waste here in the United States, and that would launch mobile Chernobyls, which are described by you as that. So, could you speak to that? And there was a referendum about this recently? A public referendum?
I'm not sure about the referendum, but what's going on is it's the latest round of a fight that's been going on for 25 years, where before Yucca Mountain, Nevada was targeted by the congressman who represents the district where I sit right now, Kalamazoo, Michigan, my hometown, Fred Upton, who is the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Very powerful member of Congress with jurisdiction over nuclear power and radioactive waste issues, has been pushing for the Yucca dump for 25 years against the consent of the state of Nevada and its population, against the will of the Western Shoshone Indian Nation, whose land it is by a treaty that the US government signed. Well, since they didn't get away with Yucca so far, the Obama administration came up with this idea of centralized interim storage. And we had faced it in the past. So the Skull Valley Goshutes Indian Reservation in Utah, for example, was targeted with what I call a parking lot dump because it's de facto permanent.
Okay, we have a freeze on the program.
Surface storage.
Okay. Yeah.
And Obama's Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, which met from 2010 to 2012, recommended parking lot dumps as its highest priority. And now we see the Department of Energy going around the country. Just yesterday, June 2nd, they were in Boston, Massachusetts. So that's the nearest of these public meetings to Vermont. They're trying to define consent because one of the concepts that came out of the Blue Ribbon Commission was consent-based siting. So the DOE's notion of consent is very minimal. The governor says it's okay. Maybe the county government of the host site says it's okay. Maybe the local government says it's okay. And so one question, for example, that Allison Fisher at Public Citizen asked at the DOE's kickoff meeting in Washington, DC last January was, how does the present generation of political leadership speak on behalf of all future generations? This stuff is deadly for 1 million years into the future. I don't think DOE even had an answer. That's above their pay grade, was maybe one of their flippant responses. So that's the kind of thinking. And of course, a couple years ago, when these ideas were being pushed in the US Senate, the Republican senators like Risch from Idaho joked openly out loud that consent just means incentives, which is a euphemism for bribes, really. They're going to bribe, oftentimes, a people of color community, an impoverished community with an offer they can't refuse. So much money, which is pocket change for the Department of Energy or the nuclear power industry. That's what happened at Skull Valley Goshutes. The tribe was offered, the rumor was, because it was a secret amount, $50 million to $200 million. And some of that money was already flowing. And so the supporters of the dump at Skull Valley Goshutes had brand new mobile homes, had new vehicles. The opponents to the dump still lived in, real destitution. And the leader of the opposition to the dump, Margene Bull Creek, who was a very proud traditional Skull Valley Goshute, would scold me when I would say words like impoverished or destitution. She didn't like it at all that I would say that because she was so proud and had so much dignity, and she didn't like her, home being described that way. But that was what was going on. Just buy people off. And right now, the biggest target is a place called Waste Control Specialists Limited Liability Corporation in the desert of West Texas in Andrews County, right on the New Mexico border. It has already applied to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission for a license to construct and operate a parking lot dump. They've already got a low-level waste dump, so-called, that takes waste from all over the country, Class A, Class B, Class C, which is intensely radioactive. Vermont and Texas and Maine are in a compact of 3 states. And so Vermont has been shipping its waste to West Texas. There is a part of the establishment of this dump, but they've thrown the doors open to the whole country now. And it is out of control. I mean, this facility is located above the Oglala Aquifer or immediately adjacent to it. 3 staff members, career staff members of the Texas State Environmental Agency a decade or so ago resigned in protest over the opening of that dump because of the risks to the Oglala. And for those who don't know, the Oglala stretches from Texas to South Dakota and is a primary source of irrigation and drinking water for numerous states, and that's being put at risk by this dump. And now they want to park high-level radioactive waste at the surface.
It sounds like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is going along with this.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is an absolutely captured agency. It is a rubber stamp agency. It is worse than ever. Just now at Palisades near Kalamazoo, as but one example of many, NRC just let Entergy, which owns Palisades, just like it owns Vermont Yankee, just let Entergy off the hook for a major safety scandal dating back many years, where NRC's own Office of Investigations, it took them years to arrive at this conclusion, but they concluded that Entergy had acted willfully in violating safety regulations at Palisades that culminated ultimately with a leak in the Lake Michigan, of radioactive water. They let them off the hook for that. They agreed to disagree with Entergy as to whether those violations were willful after their own Office of Investigations had concluded that they were willful. So NRC is a bankrupt agency. They run interference for the industry. They keep the public at bay and keep the public distracted with their meaningless dog and pony shows. The American people are in a real deep trouble because of this wholesale regulatory retreat, dereliction of duty. I can't come up with strong enough words to describe how bad the NRC is.
Kevin, do you want to talk about a recent decision that impacted Beyond Nuclear and other agencies today? You said that there was a decision that was just made before we came on air. What was that? What is that?
About an hour ago, I learned that the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia ruled against our lawsuit regarding the NRC's nuclear waste confidence policy. So this is a ruling against the state of Vermont, the state of New York, other states, an environmental coalition comprised of dozens of groups across the country, and also an Indian tribe in Minnesota called the Prairie Island Indian Community. This has been a many years long legal battle. In 2012, we won. These lawsuits are referred to as the 2012 ruling was New York versus NRC 1. And this case that we just lost today was New York versus NRC 2. Pretty much the courts have deferred to the NRC to, in their technical, wisdom and knowledge, they've got carte blanche to do whatever they want on nuclear waste, which is very dangerous. The court made the right decision in 2012. They ordered the NRC to address for the first time in an environmental impact statement the risks of nuclear waste generation, the risks of nuclear waste storage pool fires, the risk of storage pool leaks, the risk that a repository will never be opened in this country and the wastes will just remain where they're at, the reactor sites or a parking lot dump. The NRC between 2012 and 2014 went through the motions of addressing those things, but it was very shallow and meaningless. And we appealed that behavior to the courts, and we thought we had a chance because this very court issued those orders. So it was really a question of, is this court okay with its orders being flagrantly flouted by the NRC? And apparently the court is perfectly willing to let the NRC flagrantly flout its orders. And what's really ironic about this, the timing especially, is the National Academies of Sciences and a team of Princeton researchers just in the last couple weeks have issued scathing reports directed at the NRC about the risks of pool fires, pointing out for the umpteenth time in the last 10 or 15 years that these high-level radioactive waste storage pools are mega catastrophes just waiting to happen. And a news item that came out of the NAS report was that Fukushima dodged a pool fire by sheer luck, by the skin of its teeth, because a barrier between the pool and the reactor cavity happened to fail. A gate opened, and the water from the reactor cavity flooded into the pool, preventing a fire. That's the only reason a fire did not unfold at Fukushima Daiichi Unit Number 4. If that had happened, this was Prime Minister Khan's nightmare scenario of a demonic chain reaction of reactor meltdowns and pool fires, where he was secretly drawing up a contingency plan to evacuate 35 to 50 million people from Metro Tokyo and Northeast Japan to where? Southern Japan, I guess. But Those are the kind of risks associated with a pool fire. And the U.S. Court of Appeals has just decided they really don't care.
And that Prime Minister Khan was the existing prime minister during the Fukushima meltdown. He's been replaced by Abe, who was there to greet President Obama. And they both did not talk about Fukushima at all and all of these problems.
Khan and his immediate successor, Noda, were both from the Democratic Party of Japan, and that is the only exception to the rule dating back to the mid-1950s, because all the other prime ministers have been, all the other governments have been liberal Democratic Party of Japan, which is pro-nuclear.
Kevin, before we end this, I'd like you to address the situation about the closing of some nuclear power plants that you mentioned. There are 3 in one state. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's good to end on a hopeful note. Just yesterday, Exelon Nuclear, which is not only the biggest nuclear utility in the country, it's the biggest electric utility in the country, announced that because the state of Illinois did not approve a bailout amounting to $1.6 billion over a number of years, because the legislative session ended on May 31st for the summer, that they will be closing 3 reactors in Illinois. The first at Clinton, a single unit site, by a year from now, and then by 2 years from now, the site at Quad Cities, which is a 2-unit nuclear power plant. So that's the good news. 3 reactor closures announced yesterday, probably a record breaker actually in US history. But the bad news is the Associated Press got a hold of an internal email sent by Exelon CEO Christopher Crane to his entire workforce of thousands of people, urging them to call this number and leave a voicemail for the governor of Illinois, demanding that he protect their jobs, save their jobs. So apparently Exelon's lobbyists are not done. They're hoping for a special session of the Illinois legislature. They're still hoping to ram this bailout through. And this would be on the backs of Illinois ratepayers. Exelon's a profitable company, and the Illinois Attorney General, Lisa Madigan, has pointed out that this is just outrageous behavior. This is a profitable company. They want to be even more profitable, and they're holding these nuclear power plants and their workforces hostage to these lobbying shenanigans that they've been at for years now. So the fight is still on. And the fight against these money grabs by nuclear utilities extend to places like New York State, where the Alliance for a Green Economy, AGREE, has been leading the grassroots effort to prevent a similar, ratepayer-funded bailout of the upstate New York reactors, not too far from Vermont, to the tune of maybe $3.5 billion between now and 2030. And that money would be stolen from renewable energy if that goes through. And so that fight is still on. A similar fight's on in Ohio. And in DC, where we're based, we're trying to reverse the takeover of Exelon, taking over Pepco, the Mid-Atlantic utility, because that approval by the Public Service Commission was very likely illegal and is another revenue stream for Exelon. They're going to gouge the ratepayers of the Mid-Atlantic, and they're going to direct those funds to places like Illinois to prop up these age-degraded, ever more dangerous and ever more dirty atomic reactors that can't compete in an open marketplace. Kevin,
thank you very much for this very brief interview that we have with you. And viewers, Kevin Camps from Beyond Nuclear can help us break the bounds of our ignorance about all of this that's going on. Kevin, thank you so much for enlightening us on so many things.
And well, thank you, and thank the people in State of Vermont, because Vermont has been a leader on these issues. I mentioned the nuclear waste confidence lawsuit that we should have won. But in addition, taxing Entergy to pay for emergency preparedness plans that they have done away with, even though the high-level radioactive waste storage pool still has waste in it. Even the dry casks are dangerous at Vermont Yankee. So Vermont deserves tremendous praise and thanks for its hard work for such a long time.
Thank you, Kevin Camps, and please come back and visit us again.
Anytime, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, viewers. Okay.